the Thai-Burma Railway and beyond. When asked to talk about life on the railway, I felt uneasy about the title because the request suggests that there was a life during the construction of the Thai-Burma Railway. By that I mean life as I had known it prior to becoming a POW of the Imperial Japanese Army. Also, to describe the building of the railway to the uninitiated and expect them to even begin to understand must rank among the impossibles of our time. The mind cannot accept what it hears. I am enlightening you with this to emphasize my understanding of the public's reaction to the stories told about the Thai-Burma Railway built during the Second World War by Allied POWs. Therefore, this talk is based on personal experiences and witnessed events carried out by the Imperial Japanese Army and their military police, the Kempi Thai. Those atrocities were executed by the Japanese with relish and often with immense amusement. I became a POW in Bandung, Java, soon after the Japanese occupied the island. I walked into a POW camp carrying 2 suitcases filled with all manner of food. The cases were ripped immediately from my grasp. My objection to the thuggery act were rejected by Japanese fists slamming into my face and a rifle butt sending me crushing to the ground. A Japanese officer explained to me in perfect English that I was now a POW of the Imperial Japanese Army and as such had no rights whatsoever. They then proceeded to remove my personal belongings, watch, photographs, money, etc. The humiliation was complete. In minutes, I ceased to be a person. I believe to this day that they consider a worm in the earth of greater value than a POW. I was shown my quarters that consisted of the veranda of an abandoned bungalow. I shared this with 2 other POWs. The veranda was open to the elements, drafty and wet at times. We soon organized ourselves into a routine and waited for things to develop, which they did. One late afternoon, the entire camp was ordered on parade. We were confronted with the spectacle of 3 sailors, each tied to a wooden pole. A Jap officer explained that these 3 chaps had escaped from the camp, but were soon caught and were now waiting to be executed. A rumble rippled through the assembled POWs. It was a tense moment, but the cocked machine guns turned on us soon calmed things down. The sailors were executed by bayonet thrusts in the throat, the stomach, and lower abdomen. Their death was designed to be painful and slow, a warning to future escapees. It also became clear to us what kind of thugs we were dealing with. One evening it was announced that we would be taken to another place where we would be put to work on building a railroad. Those who followed orders would be well treated, others would receive harsh but just punishment. Convoys of lorries took us to Tanjung Priok, the port of Batavia, now Jakarta. We were herded onto a shabby old rust bucket and driven into the holes of the Yunjo Maru. To describe the scene is one of those occasions when even an imaginative mind fails to grasp the horror of it all. We were stacked, and I mean stacked, on elevated platforms within the hulls of the vessel. The horizontal space per man was just enough to turn over without landing on your neighbor. In some cases, bodies had to turn over in unison to avoid landing on the man next to you. Vertical space was not quite enough to sit up. A dim light at the end of each row of bodies was the only glimmer that could be seen. Each hold had one single opening at the top for ventilation. At each opening stood a Jap guard who was in total command of who was allowed on deck for natural functions. If he decided not to allow you on deck, you were confronted with a huge bayonet. A hasty retreat back into hell followed. The natural functions then took place in the hold. The first dysentery cases began to appear. The trip to Singapore took several days. Our misery and humiliation during that time was total. On arrival in Singapore, we were transported to Changi jail. Time at Changi was not too bad. The Japs left us alone and we ran our own affairs as best as we could. Food was lousy, of course, but little extras could be obtained through various obscure channels. We were obviously waiting for further orders from the Japs. Time was on our hands and tempers often flared. Time had come when we were transported to Thailand, when we found ourselves packed into steel railway trucks, normally used for cattle transportation. I shall not describe our journey, which took several days. Various books have been published describing this hell on wheels. We eventually arrived at a place called Kanchanaburi, where we were housed in long bamboo huts. The floors consisted of baked mud. The sleeping platforms consisted of bamboo slats. The allocated space per man was 2 feet. The roof in many places was open to the sky. This was to be our home for some time to come. It soon became evident that camp and personal hygiene were crucial to one's survival. I wish to mention something here which is usually avoided in literature dealing with this episode. The large base camps in the south of Thailand held thousands of men from various countries, each with their own distinctive way of life. The British had their community spirit, the Aussies their egalitarian attitude, the Dutch their individualism. The Americans were not in evidence at that time. It should therefore not be too surprising that in the days of early captivity, ugly scenes took place among the POWs. Fistfights were the order of the day, until we realized that the Japs took great delight in our squabbles. The camp atmosphere changed for the better, which also made us realize that we depended upon each other in times ahead. Our group was soon put to work on the foundations for the Kwai Bridge at Tamarkan. We were detailed to work driving wooden piles into the riverbed for the foundations of the concrete bridge supports. I would like to explain how this highly complex and technical feat was executed. Several triangular bamboo pole structures were erected which carried a pole at the top. A stout rope was pulled over the pulley. One end of the rope carried a heavy ram. The other end was splayed into several leaders which were held by POWs standing in the riverbed. Straight tree trunks were obtained from the surrounding forest, transported to the bridge by elephants or floated from upcountry. A Jap engineer decided which trees were to be used for piling. The trees were hauled into position beneath the ram and we began pile driving. On the command of a Jap standing on the riverbank shouting through a megaphone the required rhythm at which he decided that piling should take place. You pulled in unison, you let go in unison. Ichi ni, san, si, go. Ichi ni, san, si, go. On and on and on. Hour after hour after hour, from dawn to dusk, unrelenting. On returning to camp at night, it was difficult to raise the spoon to eat the slop issued to us. Your arms protested in pain, often preventing you from snatching some precious sleep. And yet, come dawn, you repeated the misery of the previous day. I often wonder about the miracle of the human body and spirit. Believe me, it is quite awesome. I was fortunate in that I was engaged in the piling operation for only a short while. When our group was taken up country to begin work on the rail embankment. This meant we were to occupy smaller camps run by Japanese non-commissioned officers. These thugs were usually power-drunk, sadistic, evil individuals. Building embankments consisted of carrying earth from alongside the track to the top of the ever-growing embankment. You carried a basket from the digging area to the top of the embankment, emptied it, and down again to be filled for your next trip up the hill. Simple, really. But in reality, this job was far from easy. The slopes of the embankment consisted of loose earth. Clambering to the top was a case of sliding and slithering with the heavy weight of earth pushing you into the soil. This too proved to be very tiring and painful on the thigh muscles, often resulting in crippling cramp. You just had to stop. You could not move. Whenever this happened, the Japs were on you with their heavy sticks. Somehow you got going again, if only to escape the painful blows. Also, the soil alongside the track varied considerably, affecting the volume an individual could move during the day. At the start of each day, a Jap would decide the total volume of earth to be dug that day. By the nature of things, some finished earlier than others. The volume the following day was fixed by the fastest time obtained the previous day, thereby increasing the total workload of the entire team. It was a truly no-win situation. If a team was running late, everyone worked on until the total volume for that day was achieved. This meant that the Japs also had to stay behind. They relieved their anger and frustration by random beatings of POWs, sometimes resulting in serious injuries. I have often been asked, can you describe a typical day? A day would begin the previous evening at roll call, on return from the work site. The numbers of POWs counted then were expected to turn up for work the next morning, ignoring those who had become ill, some critical. It was a never-changing scenario. The orderly who presented a Jap with his sick list was always, and I mean always, beaten up in a show of Jap rage. The weak, sick individuals were then dragged from the so-called hospital and forced to turn out for work on the railway. Sometimes the sick returned to the camp that night, carried on a stretcher, dead. These were by no means isolated incidents. They occurred on a daily basis all along the rail track. I want to express an opinion here, which is close to my heart. As we know, numerous individuals have been praised and honored for their humanitarian work in the base camps, often enduring horrendous treatment from the Japs for ignoring their stupid orders. These individuals deserve our admiration and deepest respect. There also was the low-ranking orderly in the jungle camps, carrying out his work with steadfast dedication. He protected his charges with unstinting valor, day in, day out, often moving with great pain in his body from the beatings he received from those brave Bushido warriors. He knew for certain that every time he tried to protect his mates, he would receive a merciless, ruthless beating. He never flinched, although he was well aware that the next beating from the Japs could cripple him for life, even kill him. That, to me, is heroism of the highest order. I do not recall seeing their names in the honors lists. I have been intrigued by ex-POWs remembering the names of Jap guards and the camps they occupied. Perhaps it is because I was never long enough in a particular camp to become familiar with their names. However, there is always the exception, and that was Horseface. The reason for his nickname becomes obvious when one looks at the sketch of his face depicted in my mother's book, Lest We Forget. He was a Korean guard of the worst type. His favorite enjoyment was that of loitering at the tail end of a column of POWs returning from a day's slavery on the railway and prodding them with his bayonet, the point of which he had honed to a razor-sharp edge. It never caused serious damage, but it always drew a trickle of blood. On spotting the blood, he would grunt with pleasure, his face distorted in ecstasy. He would then select his next victim. I will also demonstrate to you the crazy philosophy of these creatures. I refer to what I call the kitchen incident. In one camp in the north of Thailand, it occurred that it was my turn to raid the Jap cookhouse in the hope of finding something to eat. It was known to us that the Japs had confiscated a consignment of Red Cross parcels, which was their usual procedure. I was able to nick a tin of fruit. On my way back to my eagerly awaiting mates, I was suddenly confronted with a glistening bayonet, followed by a crick in the groin. I was terrified. I was marched to the guardhouse with the bayonet in close attendance. The ritual beating began. Several of the guards pounced on me at the same time. When eventually the sergeant in charge of the camp appeared, he ordered them to stop. I could not have been a pretty sight. I certainly did not feel it. He drew his sword and pointed it at my neck, grinning. He addressed me in broken English, from which I understood that stealing from the Imperial Japanese Army was a serious crime, because by doing so one steals from the Emperor, and the punishment for such a crime was death by beheading. At some point, I managed to explain to him that I could not possibly be a thief by taking something that was mine in the first place. This was not a good move on my behalf, because the sergeant went into a terrifying rage, slashing his sword about in front of my face. I really felt that my life would be ended there and then. However, he calmed down and ordered that I be taken to the sergeant's punishment tree, some 10 meters in front of the guardhouse. I had watched many a comrade undergo the sergeant's favorite punishment and realized that it was now my turn. I was propped against the tree, my arms pulled back and tied at the wrists behind the tree trunk. After a few more punches in the face, they left me alone. The pain that lashes your body after a while, I must leave to your imagination. When morning broke, they put a wooden bucket filled to the brim with water in front of me and left me to it. A sophisticated torture, if ever there was one. Parade was called when it was explained that this punishment was for stealing from the Emperor Hirohito and that I would be executed later on. I do not remember anything after that. As you are aware by now, the execution did not take place. The terror of it was you never knew whether it was an idle threat or an official statement. I came to in the so-called hospital with a comrade trying to trickle water into my mouth. I have never found out why I was caught, though there was suspicion. These things did happen now and then. A short while after that, I was back on the railroad. Cholera. Once you have lived through a cholera epidemic in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, you do not have to be afraid of ever finding yourself in hell. There will be no purpose. You have been there, and worse. Overnight, the huts were filled with the dead and the dying. The Japs were terrified of this disease and hastily retreated to a safe distance after barricading the entrance to the camp with X-shaped barricades and rolls of razor wire. We were instructed to incinerate our dead, not to bury them. Cholera strikes swiftly without warning. It is terminal in the absence of medication. Our medics kit did not even contain one aspirin tablet. Combined with the emaciated state we were in, the onslaught was terrifying. You could be okay in the morning and dead in the evening. Once dehydration set in, your place on the pyre was assured. I was one of a team attending the funeral pyre for a while, depositing the bodies of my friends into the flames. This was a round-clock operation, 24 hours a day. It was particularly macabre and frightening at first. Bodies would suddenly sit up, or an arm or leg extend jerkily. But even this horror soon became a routine job. On the acceptance of death, I recall a typical incident. Once, after a day's work on the embankment, a mate next to me lay down for the night's rest when he turned to me and said, "I feel lousy and very tired." The next morning, I shook him to make sure that he was awake. He was not. He was dead. Died during the night, quietly. The orderlies came and took him away. Another identity tag into the rusty metal tin. At some time during the day, someone would say, "Where's old Tony?" The reply was, "Oh, he's had it. Packed up last night." Someone muttered, "Lucky bastard, he's out of it." There never was intended disrespect. Death had become an accepted part of our daily existence on the railway of death. The cholera outbreak lasted for several horrendous days. It took away many of my friends. I do not recall the total death toll. I learned after the war that some camps occupied by indented labor were entirely wiped out because of the cholera epidemic. These poor people were lured onto the railway by false promises of good pay and adequate food. Entire families moved into the jungle labor camps. The plight of these simple folk was never investigated nor published. They died in their thousands, wherever they happened to be at the moment of death. Men, women and children. For them, no graves, no grieving relatives or friends, no memorial services, just oblivion. The railway was completed on the 17th of October 1943 at Kolkata in Thailand, not far from the Three Pagoda Pass. I shall not enter into the statistics or technical data involved in building the railway of death. They have been recorded in historical documents. It is, however, worthwhile to note that the railway was 415 kilometers long, not including sidings, etc., and built from scratch in just 16 months. A previous assessment by British engineers for building this railway was 5 years, but not considered a viable proposition because of the jungle terrain and the expected death toll of the labour force. The total labour force employed during the construction of the Thai-Burma Railway consisted of about 68,000 Allied POWs and 200,000 Asian labourers. The combined death toll was around 110,000. Consider for just a moment how these human beings died, where they died, but above all, why they died. When the railway was completed, teams of maintenance workers were formed by the Japs, moving up and down the track, repairing and maintaining bridges, tracks, embankments, etc. I was one of a group sent to northern Thailand and into Burma, to the caves into the hillsides. These caves were used by the Japs for ammunition storage. The caves were connected to the main railway by camouflaged small gauge tracks. At some point we were ordered to dig tank traps in close proximity to our camp. Tank traps in the middle of fervid jungle, we asked ourselves. These tank traps were of considerable length and width. Then someone offered the thought that these tank traps looked remarkably like mass graves, which indeed they turned out to be, because later evidence proved without doubt that the Japanese High Command had issued orders to their field commanders that from a certain date onward all Allied POWs should be eliminated without trace. I have copies of these orders, and I can read you the main items of it. The first one read, "Whether they are destroyed individually or in groups, or however it is done, with mass bombing, poisonous smoke, poisonous drowning, decapitation, or what, dispose of them as the situation dictates." The other one reads, "In any case, it is the aim not to allow the escape of a single person, to annihilate them all and not to leave any trace." Those were the orders from the Japanese High Command. The Hiroshima bomb prevented the unthinkable. On 18th of August 1945, at dawn, I went on my usual trip to the latrines, expecting the early morning ritual from the guard for either not spotting me in time to bow, or bowing to an empty space while he was hiding a few yards away. But the bashing never came. No shouts of "Kura! Kura!" Nothing stirred. There was an eerie silence. Others shuffled by as bemused as I was. I collected my mate, and together we crept to a point where the guardhouse could be seen. Not a Jap in sight. Could this be a trap? Waiting for something to happen, giving them the excuse to open fire on us? The hated fried egg, which usually hung draped at the bottom of the flagpole after sundown, had gone. Empty crates and rubbish strewn all over the place. I recall looking at each other in total disbelief. We entered into the open space, every sinew in our body tensed, expecting every second the rapid sound of machine gun fire. Nothing happened. Still no Japs. Then someone shouted, "The bastards have gone." And so they had. After a while, a few natives appeared, telling us with gestures and much excitement that the Japs indeed had gone during the night. Later we learned that the war had ended 3 days earlier, on the 15th of August. I cannot begin to tell you how this news was received by us. Some sank to their knees and prayed. Others stood there, tears streaming down their haggard faces. A few were running around, wildly gesticulating and screaming as if demented. I could not grasp the enormity of what had happened. I had become a person again, as sudden as it ripped away from me those long, long years ago. I remember the feeling of triumph that swept over me. I had done it. I had outlived all attempts by Hirohito and his murdering thugs to kill me. But above else, I could say no again to anything and anybody. It is called democracy and freedom. Believe me, it is worth fighting for. Eventually, we found a serviceable locomotive and some flat tops on a nearby siding. We began our journey south with great care and little progress. Then, after only a short while, a cry from the leading flat top pierced the air. Our ordeal was over. A rescue train came slowly steaming up the track towards us. 2 Red Cross flags flying on either side of the locomotive. The train had left a base camp in the south, picking up survivors as it rattled up the track. They had been told about us, but did not know where we were, because the Japs had ensured that no administrative evidence about us could be found. I do not recall having been given so many pills and injections in one single day. But I do recall the warmth coursing through my veins on swapping jokes with the medics, the feeling of belonging to be among your own. The aftermath of the railway atrocities affected many POWs in different ways. Some showed minor problems, some were crippled for the rest of their lives. Others spent the rest of their days in hospital. Many suffered mental problems. A few could not handle the return to normal life and committed suicide, the most distressing fatality of all. Still others saw their marriage torn apart, often because of complete character change. I was one of the lucky ones. My problems were manageable, though still with me today. The problems I had to deal with whilst working on the railway were mainly chronic dysentery, malaria attacks, of which one was touch and go, acute vitamin deficiency, and a small tropical ulcer on my left foot, which miraculously healed after exposing the wound to small fishes in a nearby river. These ulcers were the most feared of all among the POWs. They caused terrible limb disfigurement and often required amputation without an anesthetic. But there was always the malnutrition problem, causing such slaughter among the POWs. Many went blind as a result of prolonged vitamin deficiency. Others lost their teeth as a result of chronic pellagra. I finished up with an enlarged spleen, an enlarged liver, and heart, and a permanent disorder of my digestive system as a result of dysentery over many years. On the whole, I managed well, in contrast with many of my old comrades, who have lived lives of misery since their release from hell. I had difficulty in adjusting to civic life and was treated by a psychiatrist for a while. Within a year of returning to normality, I was ready to face the world again, and that is what I did. One incredible point I have in common with other people alive: we still have nightmares after more than half a century of civilized living. It would seem that the brain does not forget, however hard one tries to wipe out certain events. I cannot make up my mind whether this is a good or bad thing. I have been encouraged by well-meaning friends to forgive and forget and get on with life. I have no problem in getting on with life, but to forget and forgive is impossible. I do not forgive because it is not my right to forgive. In the name of Harry, John, Bob, Case, Digger, Lofty, Tuffy, Scotty, Paddy, Jan. They were my friends then. They are my friends still. They have a voice no more. I cannot forget for fear of omitting to alert our young of today of man's inhumanity to man. There are memories and emotions I treasure. It is hard to explain, but in some way I feel privileged to have endured the Thai Burma Railway episode. It is given to few to observe their fellow beings stripped of the trappings of civilization. The raw nature of man soon emerges once the protective mantle of society is ripped away. I have observed men of immense influence and stature in civic life crumble like dry earth when confronted with issues affecting their own life or that of their comrades. A truly pathetic and pitiful sight. On the other hand, there was a man who in Civic Street was the head of an elementary school. A typical man for this job by appearance, if you like. Bald-headed with a fringe of hair around the back of his head. Slightly built, small stature, walking with a slight stoop. Always polite, always civil. He used to say, "It won't last forever. They cannot possibly win this war. Just hang on and all will be right in the end." Then one day on the railway, he jumped in front of a Jap who was beating a sick friend. He shouted at the thug that if he wanted to be a hero by beating up a POW, he should pick on a so-called fit person. The Jap proceeded to do just that with great abandon. The schoolmaster received a terrible beating. We had to carry him back to the camp on a stretcher that night. This timid, friendly little man rose to be a giant of mental strength, a beacon for us all to follow. We were separated later on, and I have not heard from this marvelous man since. There are many examples like this, exposing human nature at its best and worst. I firmly believe that nothing that lies so as an ex-FIPO who has endured the Thai-Burma Railway can ever be as bad. It is a useful thought to keep alive. There are those who, for reasons best known to themselves, steadfastly deny the documented darker passages of the Thai-Burma Railway history. To them I say, go and see the cemeteries in many countries in the Far East where thousands upon thousands lie in eternal peace. These are not soldiers whose lives were snuffed out by a searching enemy bullet. These were defenseless, sick, starving, emaciated human beings, killed with intent. Go to these places. Then, if you have the courage, look into my eyes and tell me it is not true, it never happened. Another episode of recent times was always with me. Allow me to explain. During the VJ commemorations in 1995, I held an exhibition of my paintings at the Beverly Vivis Gallery in Worcester, depicting Japanese atrocities carried out on the Thai-Burma Railway. It soon got around and the media turned up in force. As a result, people came to the gallery from all over the place and from all walks of life. The emotions released on looking at my pictures and for the first time understanding a little of what happened to their loved ones was an experience almost beyond description. There was a tall man standing in the center of the gallery, his fists clenched, tears trickling down his bearded face. His father had died on the Thai-Burma Railway. His grave was never found. All there remained was his father's name on a plaque. How can one ever forget such anguish, such pain? With this in mind, I can only hope that my surviving comrades will be able to live out their remaining years content with the knowledge that they fought a just fight, regardless of how trite and outdated such sentiments may appear today. We took everything the enemy could throw at us. We survived the war and we survived hell. It is my fervent hope that future generations never have to face what we went through. But should the need arise, I hope they will be blessed with another such generation of men and women. To end my story, there follow a few words based on the theme of the famous words, "When you go home, tell them of us and say, we gave our today for your tomorrow." My words are these. And when I came home, I told them about us, the dead and the surviving. Few listened, nodding, smiling, forgetting. The widow held my hand, kissing me on the cheek lightly, not to rouse the pain within, and walked away, sadly, proudly. Yes, I told them about us when I came home. Thank you for listening.